Hey, welcome to Radicalize Me. If you enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing. And if you can, donate on Patreon to help keep us going. Thanks. Many have posed the question, what are the politics of Star Trek's United Earth and United Federation of Planets? You've likely heard people describe them as socialist, communist, or something to that effect, while others vehemently disagree. So what I'd like to do in this video is first offer an answer to the Star Trek socialism question, and second, talk about what we know and don't know about the Federation that can provide that answer. First, let's look at communism. The strict definition of communism is a classless, stateless, and moneyless society. Does this describe the Federation? Is the Federation moneyless? The United Earth and Federation are virtually moneyless except for a Federation credit system. I'll link to a video by Ben from Generation Tech where he explains how this probably works. Good video. Citizens don't need money for basic necessities like food, housing, clothing, medical care, and travel doesn't seem to cost much, if anything, at least within Earth. In Voyager, Tom Paris mentions taking a joyride day trip from San Francisco to Marseille, France, in his father's shuttle. In Deep Space Nine, the Siskos sometimes stay in New Orleans while Ben has business in San Francisco at Starfleet headquarters. And I believe he travels between the two by transporter, teleportation for non-Trekkies. Maybe you'd have to drop a couple of your universal basic income credits to use the transporter.
For the first few days, I was so homesick that I'd go back to my house in New Orleans every night for dinner.
Must have used up a month's worth of transporter credits.
But regardless, travel seems pretty accessible to everyone. So moneyless? Sure, I think that's fair. Is the Federation classless? Possibly. In older iterations of Star Trek like Next Generation and Voyager, it seemed like living quarters and food allotment were basically the same for all Starfleet crew members regardless of rank, perhaps with some exceptions. More recently, and I'm telling you right now, I do not care if you don't like the new shows and don't consider them canon. At all. So please, don't tell me. But more recently, Discovery depicted ensigns and cadets as having roommates, and Lower Decks shows its main characters, all of whom are low rank in Season 1, sleeping in bunk beds in a hallway. So classless is probably not a totally accurate descriptor. That being said, I don't think we've gotten a good enough look at the rest of Earth and Federation society outside of Starfleet to really determine whether class is a factor in the society at large. So classless, undetermined. And lastly, true communism would also be stateless, and both the United Earth and Federation bear strong resemblance to states or federations as we know them today, with a parliamentary system and hierarchical leadership. Now, before you say anything, no, I don't think the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc. are communist or were communist in the Soviet Union's case. I think their leaders and founders believed in communism, which is good. And I think these countries are better for workers in many ways than so-called free market states. And were all worthy experiments in creating worker states, but I don't think that means they achieved communism or socialism for that matter. So stateless, no. Socialism. Socialism comes closer to describing the United Earth and Federation because A, they have highly reduced the need for money. B, they meet all basic needs of all citizens. C, they are generally anti-imperialist. Generally. D,
we work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
But there is at least one major piece missing from the Federation's politics that prevents me from giving it the socialist seal of approval. And I suspect this is why some people tear their hair out when you use the word socialism to describe this world. That major piece is worker ownership of the means of production. And yeah, worker ownership is pretty important to the definition of socialism. I think it's most of it. And maybe we're playing a losing game trying to describe a theoretical 23rd and 24th century with 19th century political and economic terminology. But I think it's still worth having the conversation, and it's fun to speculate. Again, as far as I know, we haven't seen much of how work works in the Federation outside of Starfleet, which is essentially a military organization. We can probably assume a military would be more hierarchical, even in a socialist economy, unless it was a fully anarchist society. It's possible that other workplaces in the Federation are worker-owned and operated. We have some companies that function this way today, known as worker co-ops or collectives, and some of these still have managers, but usually in that case the workers would vote for their managers and receive a larger share of the profits generated by their work. Profits may not be much of a factor in the Federation, but workers could still have a say over their managers and how to distribute what they produce. The Federation generally doesn't shy away from hierarchy, so maybe we could guess that their system is more similar to what is sometimes called state capitalism. This is, according to Marxist economist Richard Wolff, the best way to describe the economic system of the USSR.
Toward the end of his life, Lenin, the first great leader of the Soviet Union, described how he understood the new Soviet society that the revolution of 1917 had brought into being. He referred to what they had as, and this is crucial, state capitalism. What did he mean? He said very clearly, we socialists have taken over the government. That's what the revolution accomplished. So now we have enterprises, some run by private enterprise owners, some run by the state.
State capitalism is basically what Americans think socialism is. As the old saying goes, Americans believe socialism is when the government does things. There are a lot of reasons why this misconception exists, but the point is that socialism is worker control over the means of production, be that through a worker co-op model, public ownership, or some kind of cooperative anarchist model. And although social welfare is not socialism, a socialist system would also likely include universal social programs and provide for the basic needs of all citizens, much like our Federation friends. No modern country has quite achieved socialism. The countries we know as socialist or communist have had mixed results as to how close they've gotten. One big reason for this misconception was Joseph Winifred Stalin himself. Now, Stalin, wait 1 second, let me grab my CIA propaganda script. I know it's here somewhere. Stalin was a bit of an authoritarian. I know we've been given a lot of misinformation about the USSR, but I don't have time or the expertise to spend this video talking about which bad things Stalin did or didn't do, so leave me alone. But the fact is, authoritarians love to puff up their country to the rest of the world. All leaders do, but authoritarians go hard. Stalin kind of got tired of transition and basically announced to the world that the USSR had achieved socialism. From that point on, it was far too easy to tie socialism to all the bad things Stalin may or may not have done. Again, I am massively oversimplifying this because it's a video about fucking Star Trek, so chill, comrades. However we want to label Federation society, it's indisputable that in many ways they have moved beyond capitalism. First off, we can look at the way the franchise depicts capitalists. The most frequent capitalist stand-ins are the Ferengi, these disgusting little monsters who are not part of the Federation. They're unabashedly greedy, and their society is governed by the rules of acquisition, a code of questionable ethics including many economic aphorisms such as treat people in your debt like family, exploit them, and money is everything. The one major exception to this Ferengi behavior is my man Rom, who is a legend among leftist Star Trek fans for the Deep Space Nine episode Bar Association, where he forms a union with his co-workers at the bar owned by his brother Quark.
We're the Guild of Restaurant and Casino Employees, and we're here to present our demands.
We do get hints at times as to how the people of Earth and the Federation think about work. In Bar Association, the episode I just mentioned, it is Julian Bashir, a Starfleet doctor, who first suggests that Rom form a union.
What you people need is a union.
A what?
You know, a trade guild, a collective bargaining association, a union.
Then, it's Miles O'Brien, a Starfleet engineer, who further encourages Rom by regaling him with the story of his ancestor Sean O'Brien, who, in universe, led a famous Western Pennsylvania coal mine strike in 1902.
Oh, he died a hero.
He was more than a hero. He was a union man.
When Rom later calls a strike, O'Brien and Bashir post up outside the bar and try to guess whether passers-by will honor the strike or cross the picket line. When their co-worker Worf, who grew up on Earth but is part of the warlike Klingon race, and who knows what their labor laws are like, enters the bar, they're so intent on dissuading him that it turns into a fight. Then Captain Sisko makes very clear to Quark where he stands, even threatening to end Quark's sweet deal with the station and the Federation if he doesn't meet with Rom.
5 years of back rent, plus power consumption, plus repairs. Do you know how much latinum that is?
All of this is important because although the aforementioned Starfleet officers work on the station and Sisko runs the place, Deep Space Nine is not a Federation space station, and the Starfleet crew members are usually very careful not to impose Federation or human values on the station's non-Federation residents.
As a Starfleet officer, I am bound by oath not to interfere with Bajoran affairs.
This suggests that the pro-labor views Sisko, Bashir, and O'Brien express in this episode were so important to them that they made an exception to their respect for other cultures. Right? So Sisko didn't tolerate Worf doing a ritual killing on the station just because it was a Klingon custom, and he wouldn't tolerate Quark's unfair labor practices just because it was a Ferengi custom. At least not when it got to the point of a strike. And while Bashir tried to walk back his recommendation a bit when Rom took him seriously, he and O'Brien didn't hesitate to give Rom advice about unionizing and striking. It's also important to note that Sisko, Bashir, and O'Brien didn't know each other before they were all assigned to Deep Space Nine in Season 1. It almost seems like fair labor practices are baked into Federation society. Residents know about unions and their history, but perhaps don't see the need to create them because the nature of work is so different in the 24th century. This idea might make our skin crawl as Marxists, but again, we're trying to apply 19th century economic terminology to a speculated 24th century, and it's impossible to imagine how much things might change between now and then. Deep Space Nine is set in the 2370s, around 350 years from today. If you're lucky enough to have a 9-to-5 Monday through Friday office job with a salary and benefits in 2021, I know many of us don't, I don't, but if you do, imagine explaining that situation to a serf or a slave from the year 1671. Your job would not even come close to their concept of work. In Star Trek Enterprise, a prequel series set in the 22nd century, there is a Season 1 episode where a group of Ferengi raid the ship and force Captain Archer to move everything they want into their shuttlecraft. While he's working, Archer asks his Ferengi supervisor how their business model works and how they split the profits.
You must get a bigger percentage than your crewmates.
Actually, I get the smallest.
That doesn't seem fair. You're the one doing all the work.
Then, Archer reveals something interesting about Earth's history.
A man is only worth the sum of his possessions.
Back on my homeworld, that kind of thinking almost destroyed our civilization.
This next one is a light spoiler alert. In Star Trek Discovery, Season 3, the crew of the Discovery has traveled from the 23rd century to the year 3189 to find that the Federation has been reduced to a shell of its former self, with only a fraction of the member planets it once had. At one point, the head of what remains of Starfleet is in talks with this green lady from another interplanetary union called the Emerald City. I mean the Emerald Chain. Get it? Because she's green. She wants to merge the Emerald Chain with the Federation of Planets, and at one point taunts this guy, saying that some Federation member planets are already practicing capitalism. This must mean that the Federation had previously not practiced capitalism and hoped to keep it that way.
And I aims to keep it that way.
Her intention being to suggest that the Federation doesn't have the control or influence it once did. Anti-capitalism, generally, is socialism. Even if you go further left, to communism, anarcho-syndicalism, what have you, these ideologies all share the characteristic that they seek to empower workers and decentralize economic power, which is socialism. If nothing else, I think it's safe to assume there are a few people behind Star Trek with socialist sensibilities. LeVar Burton, who directed Bar Association, spoke positively of socialism on Gates McFadden's podcast recently.
You know, America has this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. It's all bullshit. The idea that socialism is evil is I think, something that needs to be bred out, educated out of the psyche of America.
And it's rumored that both Gene Roddenberry and Leonard Nimoy were socialists, though I haven't really been able to confirm that. And some of the series, especially Deep Space Nine, seem to make as much of an anti-capitalist statement as they could get away with on TV during their time. Yet we don't get to see democratized workplaces or get much of a sense of the class structure in this society. In fact, as far as I can tell, we never even hear the word socialism in any iteration of Star Trek. There are two possible reasons for this. Maybe more, but I could think of two. When Star Trek first aired in 1966, you could not call yourself a socialist in the US without getting into trouble. And you certainly couldn't openly make a network TV show about it. This was the middle of the Cold War and the Vietnamese resistance war against America. The Cuban Revolution had just happened. The House Committee on Un-American Activities had spent the previous 2 decades outing and often ruining the lives of American socialists. Many socialist actors and others in the entertainment industry were blacklisted from Hollywood.
That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are trying to destroy.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Well, you will pretty soon.
Again, I don't know for sure the political beliefs of Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek and TNG, but it's entirely possible that he was a socialist and tried to work it into the show as stealthily as he could because he didn't feel safe stating it overtly. Rod Serling insisted he would not put political messages in the Twilight Zone. Meanwhile, if you've watched a few episodes, you know he did all the time.
I don't want to have to battle sponsors and agencies. I don't want to have to push for something that I want and have to settle for second best. I don't want to have to compromise all the time, which in essence is what the television writer does if he wants to put on controversial themes.
The other possibility is that socialism in Star Trek just never really occurred to Roddenberry. There are a million different leftist ideologies, and it could be he just happened to almost stumble upon one in designing this fictional world. I tend to think these kinds of creative decisions are not accidents, but we definitely have evidence that Star Trek didn't start out in the 60s with some grand unified Marxist theory. In a season 1 episode of the original series called The Devil in the Dark, the Enterprise travels to a mining colony called Janus 6, so Kirk, Spock, and Bones can investigate the death of 50 miners.
Bitter. Like the rest of them. Burned to a crisp.
To shreds, you say?
It turns out that the miners were killed by this pile of couch stuffing. Ultimately, the Enterprise crew are able to communicate with it and realize that it lives in the caves, and its home was threatened by some of the mining practices. It's also naturally adept at burrowing, and leaves behind large, stable tunnels when it does so, which is, of course, perfect for the miners. So Kirk works out a deal between the miners and the moldy ball of old pizza toppings that they'll stay out of each other's way and stop the acts that were hurting each other.
They tunnel, you collect and process.
But then Kirk says something interesting.
And your process operation would be 1,000 times more profitable.
Profit? In this economy? And this wasn't a fluke.
Once Mother Horta tells her kids what to look for, you people are going to be embarrassingly rich.
The best excuse I can come up with for this discrepancy is that these series are set in different centuries, and it's entirely possible things changed. In the backstory of Star Trek, Earth went from worldwide devastation from World War III and climate change in the 2060s, look forward to that, I guess, to the events of Enterprise in about 90 years. So that's a pretty big change. The Federation doesn't even exist until the end of Enterprise in 2161. Then there's the original series in the 23rd century, TNG, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Lower Decks in the 24th, Picard in the late 24th, early 25th, Discovery in the 23rd, and then 32nd. That's a lot of time to cover, and a lot can happen. Think about just 100 years ago in real life. We didn't even have TVs or fucking Social Security. Just weird, dumb little cars and Gatsby parties. It could also be that even though Janus was a Federation mining colony, it dealt with many societies, some of them not part of the Federation. Federation credits might come into play in this case. They might actually need to think in terms of profits. Or it could even be that profit was an old colloquialism that stuck around despite society moving away from the acquisition of wealth as a goal in itself. And Kirk just meant that they'd be able to increase production. These explanations are fun to think about and can help in the suspension of disbelief as you enjoy the shows. But the real-world answer is probably just that they hadn't created all the rules of this universe yet, so you end up with inconsistencies. Apparently, it was a writer named Gene Kuhn who joined late in the first season who first came up with the Federation and Starfleet, so they didn't even start out with those entities. So all of that being said, how should we describe the economics of the Federation? It might be state capitalist, like we talked about. I settle on some kind of advanced social democracy. Think of places like Norway or Denmark. While certain US politicians have erroneously referred to Nordic economies as a kind of socialism, what those countries have done is decommodify necessities and expand state ownership and the social welfare state. Now, because these countries are still fundamentally capitalist, the money funding this welfare state is coming from unethical sources. But the Federation pretty much takes everything good about the Nordic model and takes it to the next level. Almost everything is free. Maybe you have to spend a few credits at Chateau Picard or Cisco's Creole Kitchen, but no matter what, everyone gets food, housing, and education. It's just not quite a dictatorship of the proletariat. And again, a lot of the reason I don't call the Federation socialist is because of omitted details, not contradictory details. I would love to see the communist/socialist version of Star Trek. Let's see a Trek show about working life in Philadelphia in the 24th century. Right? Star Wars does stories outside the main saga now. Let's see more of that with Star Trek, too. Enough Starfleet. We get it already. Show me a fucking worker-owned dilithium mill or something. What do you think? Do you agree that the Federation doesn't quite measure up to socialism? Or is there some part of the canon I missed that proves me wrong? Let me know in the comments. And try to keep it civil. Because remember,
It's just a TV show.
thanks for watching. If you like what we do here, please hit like and subscribe. And if you want, you can even donate at patreon.com/radicalizeme. If you want to hear me interview leftist activists, you can listen to my podcast of the same name over at radicalizemepod.com or the other podcast places. And that's it. See you next time.